Hello, and welcome to a journey into a designer's process. I'm Lewis, and in this presentation I'm going to talk about how my design process works in theory and practice. I'll do this by analyzing a model I developed based off how I worked during one of my animation projects. I'll talk about why I like to work in this way, what about it works for me, some of the challenges I had in undertaking this approach in practice, and how it differs from the process models I discussed in my essay. This is a diagram of my process I developed inspired by the models I examined in my essay and by reflecting on my animation design process. My model consists of four main stages: discover, design, develop, and evaluate. Each of these stages are broken down into micro steps, which will be examined in detail throughout the presentation. This model of my process shows how I would ideally work rather than what I necessarily achieved. The main steps of my process are based off the steps of the waterfall model, but unlike the waterfall model, mine isn't linear. The waterfall model consists of four sequential steps: discover, design, develop, and test. Each of these steps is dependent on the last, and before advancing to the next stage, the previous must be completed, reviewed, and approved. An advantage of this approach is that it's clear and easy to follow. However, on the contrary, it also means that if issues are discovered at a later stage in the process, it can be hard to take a step back to the previous stages in order to correct those issues. My process works in a more iterative way because adjustments and improvements are made with each repetition of the micro steps in each stage of the process. These micro steps are where my model shares similarity with the structure of the spiral model, which I discussed in my essay. The spiral model consists of four main stages which go through a series of cycles. With each cycle, prototypes are created and tested, and the next cycle is planned. An advantage to this approach is that it makes it easier to customize, adjust, and make improvements to the functionality of a design later in the process. However, it also means that the time spent on preparation, rearranging objectives, and prototyping may be disproportionate. An iterative approach works well for me because it allows me to vastly explore my options and make sure my ideas and solutions are well thought out, planned, and executed efficiently. The first stage of my process is the discover stage. Here I review the brief, research and look for inspiration, then generate ideas and do a rough review. These steps are repeated until a solid idea or solution is created or an illumination is had. This slide shows an example of how the discover stage looked in my animation project. First, I reviewed the brief. This is where I made sure I understood the set requirements of the project, like the time constraints, types of animation, and theme. I now knew my animation had to be no longer than 90 seconds, had to use 4 types of analog animation, and had to be themed to sense of place. Next, I looked for inspiration. Here I conducted research based on the set requirements of the brief. From there I generated ideas. This is where I mind mapped and listed general ideas and concepts for my animation. I then did a rough review of those ideas. I continued to repeat these steps, this time looking for inspiration by relating my own personal experiences and observations to the set theme. It is at this point I had an illumination and thought of my concept of an animation about gambling addiction. Although this method worked for me in this instance, a downfall of it could be that it's too time consuming and relies too heavily on an illumination. If an illumination isn't had, it could be hard to anticipate an end to this stage in the process. The second stage of my process is the design stage. Here I conceptualize my idea, gain feedback on my concepts, and collaborate to gain ideas on how they could be executed. I then refine my concepts based on the feedback and collaboration. I repeat these steps until the best solutions are found. This slide shows an example of the benefits of gaining feedback from my peers and tutors on my concept and collaborating with them on how to execute them. Here I knew I wanted my animation to have a repetition of the same shot and within that display the negatives of addiction on the reels of a poker machine. I also knew I wanted to put emphasis on the amount of time wasted due to gambling addiction. However, it's only through gaining feedback on my concepts and collaborating that the idea to have a character in the shot progressively getting older with each repetition was developed. The feedback and collaboration steps are vital to my process as they help give me a new perspective on the project and help me think more creatively. On the other hand, because I rely so heavily on feedback and collaboration, it can sometimes be a challenge for me to trust and develop my own choices or make a decision on which feedback to incorporate and how to integrate feedback from different people. The third stage of my process is the development stage. Here's where I create prototypes of my concepts, test them, gain feedback, then refine them. I continue to execute these steps until I have working prototypes to work from. This is the point in my animation process where I started to turn my concepts into a reality. Here I created prototypes of both a poking machine and reels and tested how they looked animated together. After getting some feedback from a peer, I realized that I needed a way to portray that the reels were picking up speed. This is where the idea to create several copies of the reels that go from clear to blurry and tape them together into one strip that I could manually pull through was developed. Had I not created the initial prototypes, tested them and gotten feedback, I may not have had this realization till well into the development of the animation. One of the challenges this stage presented me with was trying to implement the vision of my concepts while also learning how to work with the technology used to create animations. If I were to do it again, I would make sure I had a clear understanding of how the technology works before starting to develop my project. The fourth stage in my process is the evaluation stage. Here I put together a final draft of the project, then get feedback, refine, review, and make any final adjustments and improvements. These steps are repeated until the best solutions to developing a final product are met. In the process of creating a draft animation, evaluating it, and getting feedback from a peer, I realized I had not met the set time requirements for the animation, and would have to refine it by adding more pixel-based animation clips. I put together a new final draft, which I then got feedback from my tutor, who informed me that I needed to add more sound effects. I once again refined the animation based off the feedback, got feedback on the refined version, then finally moved on to exporting the final project. With an iterative approach, it's possible to go back to a previous stage or even the start of the process if you realize something is fundamentally not working, though the deadline for the project may mean that it's not viable. In a way, my process makes up for this by having elements of evaluation like feedback and refinement at each stage of the process. To sum up, I feel I work best when taking an iterative approach where I am able to explore my options and gain feedback throughout the process. This model is a reflection on how that would ideally look in theory, though in practice, the constraints of a project may mean that it may not play out in exactly this way. Thank you.